Poštovani gledatelji, čast mi je u programu N1 televizije pozdraviti Alexandera Stubba, bivšeg finskog premijera. Mr. Stubb, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much.
We saw today an unprecedented support of European Parliament towards Ukraine, and we saw this walkout in the UN Human Rights Council. How do you judge this moment of history we live in?
Well, I think what we're seeing is the 1989 moment of my generation, or the 1939 moment of a previous generation. The tectonic plates of international relations, geopolitics, and security are shifting. And what we are now seeing is the total and utter isolation of Russia, President Putin, and his regime. So basically, we have full-on sanctions. On top of that, we have sending of armaments, we have full solidarity, a total winning of the information war for Ukraine. And I foresee isolation from international institutions as well. We all know that they've been kicked out and correctly from the Council of Europe. So, you know, it's a historic moment.
Can you envisage where will be the end game of this?
Not really. I mean, you know, there are obviously many different options, but my imagination stopped at the moment when Vladimir Putin took the decision to invade Ukraine last Thursday at 6 o'clock in the morning, because I had thought, having participated as a peace mediator, Minister for Foreign Affairs and chairman of the OSCE in the war in Georgia, that the game plan was pretty similar to create the frozen conflict around Donetsk and Luhansk, but I was wrong. And now I don't know where this is going to go. Obviously, militarily, you know, it's been an extremely cumbersome and slow progression for Vladimir Putin, but obviously he cannot afford to lose this war. So my guess is that he will take it as far as he possibly can. And that means that we're going to see more civilian casualties, we're going to see more military casualties, and the only place where this can be stopped is Moscow, the Kremlin, and the Russian public. They simply have to get rid of him. We can't do it from the outside.
Is there the capacity within the Russian society? I spoke to many people who already fled before this because of this ban of foreign agents and several other really strong pressures on the opposition. You know, is there capacity within the Russian society for that?
I don't know. It's impossible to say. You know, Russians are great people. I have a lot of love and admiration for the people of Russia, not the regimes or the leaders of Russia. Unfortunately, over history, Russia has created a lot of, you know, dictatorial leaders who do not shy away from using force, whether on their own people or anyone else for that matter. We've seen revolution in 1917, 1918. We saw one in 1991. But again, we don't know how long we're in for this game. And this is, of course, what makes it frustrating.
Talking about frustration, we saw what you called historic, the decision of Finland to be in the contingent of EU countries to give weapons, so support, military support to Ukraine. And you've said in your previous interviews that this could push and Finland and Sweden closer to NATO membership. Do you think that this will come out of this?
Well, it's difficult to say at this moment. There's certainly a big shift. And of course, it's quite interesting because, you know, we're getting exactly the opposite effect of what Putin wanted. You know, we're seeing the Europeanification of Ukraine. We're seeing the reunification of the West. We're seeing the rejuvenation of NATO. We're seeing a more unified European Union than we've ever seen before. And now we're seeing opinion polls taking a radical shift on NATO membership here in Finland. So for those of you who haven't followed very closely, we used to be about, you know, over 50 against 24. Now, whoops, overnight, in 3 days, that changed. 53% of the Finnish population is in favor of NATO membership. And this is, of course, something that our political leadership has to take into consideration. I don't think the time for NATO membership is right now. So, you know, you don't sort of take a security guarantee or an insurance when the house is already burning. But I'm sure that this will, you know, pave the path for Finnish NATO membership eventually.
What does this invitation of today to Ukraine to become a candidate member mean?
Well, it's huge. I mean, go back 2 weeks and you wouldn't even talk about the European perspective of Ukraine. And, my thinking on this is as well that the European Union needs to rethink its whole enlargement policy because of this, because enlargement is a geostrategic decision. And we're moving to a world where Russia will be completely isolated from Western, peace-loving, Europeanized, liberal democracies who believe in human rights and fundamental rights and the rule of law. So, I think if I was the enlargement commissioner right now, I'd have a lot of contingent plans. And of course, the Western Balkans are next in line, many of the countries who haven't become members yet. So this is a conversation that has to take place. And, Serbia is, of course, one of the key parts here. And there are many complicated issues that are related to this. So you guys are going to have to think about it very carefully as well.
And talking about the Russian influence also in the Balkans, we saw the other day Sberbank is very strong in terms of, economic liaisons. And on the other side, we have also some kind of, tendencies that Republika Srpska and Bosnia have strong connections with Putin. So can this accelerate maybe the integration, or what you just said, as Ukraine got this message today, would it be necessary for Western Balkans to have the same message?
It's difficult to say. I'm only a humble professor at the European University Institute in Florence nowadays, and I try to look at things from the outside and take my analysis from there. But the European Union advances through crisis. So usually there is a crisis, then there's chaos, and then there's a suboptimal solution. I think there are a lot of issues that obviously Serbia has to deal with in its enlargement process. There are many other issues, in Bosnia. It's sort of the story never ends. So my take is that, if you are a pro-European who wants to see the eventual integration of all Western Balkans into the European Union, you're a hell of a lot more closer today than you were 2 weeks ago, that's for sure, because I think the political tide has changed. And I think Europe needs to take the geostrategic decision to think about this really, really seriously, as of course does NATO as well.
And 2 points for the end. One is that we again see the threat with nuclear arms. And the other one is that we live in a world which is unsecure in some other perspective, with hybrid warfare, with disinformation, which was a huge thing also in this world. How to tackle this kind of world and this kind of threats today?
Well, I think with the nuclear option, we have to be, very careful, even when talking about it. And I think, the West has reacted quite well, cool, calm, and collected in this particular case. The second one is that we have to understand that in today's world, everything has become weaponized. So this basically means that, you can use technology, you can use information, you can use energy. And actually, as we can see, I think France has now declared an economic war on Russia. So you use sanctions, you use isolation, you use the SWIFT system, you use transport. So this is the sort of age of unpeace, as Mark Leonard calls it, that we're entering into right now.
And for the end, you've mentioned you're now head of School of Transnational Governments in Florence, in European University. We saw a very interesting thing the other day. President Macron called two of his predecessors, Mr. Sarkozy and Mr. Hollande, to the Élysée. And Mr. Sarkozy was very gloomy, talking about today's world. He said, NATO doesn't function, EU has its problems, UN is, large, and where can we? Was this before the beginning of the war or after the beginning of the war? It was after the beginning of the war, yeah, 2 days.
Well, I don't know if he's been following the newspapers, but, I've never seen NATO more determined. I've never seen the European Union more determined. I'm looking at the UN and the walks outs from there. I'm looking at the isolation of Russia. So I don't know which media Sarkozy is following. So I don't sort of agree with this assessment, if that was his assessment.
No, but talking about, where can we go in terms of transnational governance? Because if we have, Putin regime, which excluded Russia out of it, if we have, China still keeping its cool out there, but being very strong and important force in today's world, do we come to, 2 poles, 3 poles? What's in terms of security of Europe?
Yeah, I think it's probably too early to make an assessment what this era is. I think transnationality, which basically means governance and decision making beyond and below borders, the involvement of say, government, civil society, civil service, media, academics, etc., that will continue. Then the question is what kind of poles we create. So, I used to talk about a tripolar world, China, the United States, and the European Union. But clearly now, I think the European Union and the United States are going back to the old transatlantic alliance 2.0 and creating its pole on its own. And the question is, in which direction will China pivot? Will it go and protect Russia, or will it reject Russia? That's going to be determining a lot. But remember that there's one thing that Russia does not anymore have, and that is economic power. Yeah, the energy threat is always there, but gas and oil in 10 years are stranded assets. So you can try to sell them, but they're not exactly going to be a huge hit. So Russia only has military power anymore. But the thing that scares me is I don't know how Putin is going to use that military power, but certainly too early to say whether we are in a bipolar, tripolar, or multipolar world.
You at all envisage, Putin moves, or how you call him? You know him. You were prime minister. You were minister of foreign affairs. You mentioned Georgia at the beginning in 2008. Where are we with an autocrat like him today?
To give you an honest answer, I don't know. And I think there are a lot of people who are doing a whole bunch of, psychotherapeutical analysis, which is completely out of the place. No one can go into the head of Vladimir Putin and know what exactly he's going to do. The times I have met him when I was minister and sitting next to our president or then prime minister, he seemed like a very rational, very analytical, and well-prepared individual. But I have absolutely no competence in my capacity as a professor to give judgment on his personal qualities.
Mr. Stubb, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thanks, my pleasure.